Welcome, Ekta. Thank you for making this time to talk about privacy with us. So, Ekta is an award winning designer with three IXDAs with honorary Indigo and IF awards in social and behavior change. Really admirable at like where I'm coming from. And she writes about speculative fiction set 15 years ahead in India, and she's started doing like 6 years ago, which is again like such a futuristic vision to like start with. And so from the future vision, she extracts all these elements of experience which can be woven into policy and law today. And that's what we're here to discuss with her, and how her journey began from being a designer into policy and law, and all this intersection with technology of all of that. So currently she is volunteering for TechBridge, a company which enables bridges to form between policy and tech innovations. She dances on this edge of these two disciplines constantly, often stepping into the territory of law, constitution, democracy, to understand what's needed in design today to enable a better tomorrow. And lately, she wrote an article, a very informative one, on how the new Digital Personal Data Protection Act will affect how we design digital products. So it's a very interesting piece. It's listed down very specifically, like how you need to go about understanding from like different stakeholder point of view, and how you can ensure like compliance and ethical designs based on this policy. So it's an interesting read that we can mention here later in the chat for anyone who wants to read. Okay, so welcome, Ekta.
Thank you, Manvi, and thank you, Niyam, for inviting me. It's lovely to be here, and it's lovely to talk to all the designers out there about data privacy, about how policy affects design, and how design affects policy, because it's a symbiotic relationship, right? And it's quite an interesting relationship. How we will evolve as people really depends on how we pick up policy and interpret it in our designs.
Yes, definitely. It's great to have you here. Okay, so just to like start with, you've been in product design for such a long time. So how did you end up choosing policy, and rather like how did you land up at this junction that I've mentioned a few times now?
Yeah. So, a long time ago, a bunch of us started a little bit of activism in this space, right? In this space of technology. We decided, technology is going all over the place. Let's all meet often and talk about it. So we started something called Bar Camp and Mobile Monday. This was about 15 years ago. And I started with a guy called Nikhil Pava, Prashant Singh, Sunandani Basu. One bunch of us, started, and I volunteered with them. So Nikhil Pava is into policy. And today he owns a think tank called Media Nama. And I used to go for those events, and my voice was heard in those events, and I would come up against people from Netflix, people from Facebook, people from various other large organizations, and I could put really uncomfortable questions their way, which I couldn't ask anybody else. So I got really interested in policy because I got my questions answered about the future, about how humanity is progressing, and what are our real problems, and as a person and as a designer, as a data principal, and as a data protection person, it's difficult to imagine every single scenario out there. And when you go for conferences like this, a lot of people talk about it. You see new perspectives. Your mind gets broadened in those events. So I had a lot of fun doing that, and I did realize that the policy world. I'm a thinker as well, so you put 2 and 2 together, you put 3 and 4 together, and you come up with new combinations, right? So I did that, and it seemed like the world of policy required a bit of design. And by design, I mean research-based, evidence-based policy, right? So, from that point on, I started being a little bit more interested. And when the Data Protection Bill came out first in 2017, that's when I really got engaged in this whole system. And I read the bill, and I was scratching my head when I read that draft. I said, "Ye who care? What's happening?"
Yeah.
So I went out there and I rewrote the whole thing. I rewrote the whole thing and I published it as Siena Charter. And that's when my life in public policy started. And ever since then, I've been very, very involved. I've been publishing points of view on various types of data policy, be it tech policy overall, not just data policy, be it the data protection bill, or be it the competition law, or be it the new kids on the block, which are the DNA bill and the AI bill. So lot of changes are coming our way, and we need a decoder, right?
Right.
We as designers need a decoder. We're not policy people, right?
Right.
So somebody needs to decode that
Right.
into what we can do. And so I thought that's a good place for me to be. And
Right.
so here I am.
That
Yeah.
that's brilliant. Okay, I have like a follow-up question. So like, when you had the first okay, like ye kya likha hua hai iske andar in that first
Yeah.
policy. So what's that like one thing that was like, okay, I really need to like, fix this. Like, was there like
Um,
one thing that irked you like a lot?
yeah. So I do believe, as an activist, I do believe that consent has a huge role to play in policy. And in
Right.
the first bill that came out, consent did not feature in it.
Right.
There was one thing about consent that wasn't involved in the policy so much. It was there, but it wasn't there so much.
Right.
So that was one thing that irked me. The other thing that irked me was the government was talking about keeping a copy of every single data we generate in India,
Right.
right? So every single piece of data, if we generate and if we keep that in India, it has a huge environmental impact.
Right.
Data centers have a huge environmental impact. And
Yeah.
what use would it be to keep a copy of the data in India is my question. How can you be sovereign over it if it's just a copy?
And imagine data for like 1 billion people. So
Correct, yeah. So those are the two things that really irked me. So I wrote a lot about that. I wrote about the fact that, a data center being in India does not give us ownership on the data. It does not give us sovereignty on the data at all,
right.
right? So the other thing that I wrote about is that consent has a huge role to play. Both consent and information, transparency around how data will be used and how data can be deleted, can be modified, so on and so forth, is a huge thing. And it was a huge thing abroad as well. The other data protection bills that were coming out had a huge role to play in terms of managing consent, in terms of understanding consent. So those were two things that I kind of was very vocal about in all the places where I went. And I was so happy to see that this new bill that has come out, consent is one of the biggest fulcrums of the whole bill.
Yeah.
So that's something that really I'm glad about. Very
Yeah.
glad about. Yeah.
And anyone who wants to like read more about the consent, but you can read it on her in her article that I'm gonna share in a bit as a link here. Okay, so what impact does policy have on us as designers? Because you mentioned like, we need somebody to be like decoding it for us. So all of these policies, like what impact does it eventually have on designers, decoding or not decoding?
Yeah. I think even policy and design have a symbiotic relationship.
Right.
One, the way we design affects policy. So, for example, in policy, we're talking about dark patterns. We're talking about the impact on the consumer at the grassroots. We're
Right.
talking about the impact of data leaks, etc. Right? And all of that has been something that we designers have done. Right? We've collected the data,
Yeah.
we've managed the data, and so its impact on policy is that today there are policies coming out around that. That's one,
Yeah.
right? The other piece is that when a new piece of policy comes out, we often look at it and wonder, what do we need to do it? What's our role to play? It's a back-end compliance issue. And once we create our designs, it's going to go to the back end. The compliance people will take a look at it and they'll tell me what's wrong with it.
Right.
Right. And of course, compliance people are never trained to understand dark patterns. They're never trained to understand, you know, the wrong way of collecting data, etc. They may tell us a couple of things about it, but they will not be able to set our path straight. That's for sure, right?
Right.
So it is imperative for a designer to understand how policy affects the way they design. That's one. And the other piece is that now the stakes are much higher.
Right.
The stakes have gone, the penalties and fees for not complying with policy have gone up to even 250 crores, right?
Right.
That's a huge amount of money for companies. And to leave that to one person is very tricky, right?
Yeah.
And so, and like we're the ones who had an impact on it. So we're the ones who should be able to design more ethically today
Right.
by considering policy, right? And ethical design is a big deal. You know, ethical design is hugely important for the future
Right.
because we can't enter a future with so much dystopia as we see in Black Mirror, we see on TV, we see in so many different movies, etc. They all talk about dystopia. And
Yeah.
how does this dystopia come about? This
Right.
dystopia comes about with the irreverent and irresponsible use of data as well,
As well.
right? For
That's an
sure.
evidence like across, like if you see different Black Mirror episodes, that like it's a brilliant technology but going dystopian, and you're just gonna sit and rethink like what have we done.
Exactly, exactly. So that's the role of policy, to ensure that we don't reach dystopia,
Right.
right? And if we've got that much power on the world, then we've got to understand how to pepper our actions, right? Our actions need to be peppered in that way so that we can make the right things. We
Mhm.
can make more ethical designs. We can make more acceptable and more safe designs. And so that's how it really affects the designer. Yeah.
Right. Okay, like a quick another follow-up question for you. So, okay, so there are like a lot of young designers budding in our country, myself included, irrespective of like a few years of experience. So, ethical design is something that I was venturing into like early on because of my exposure. But I believe that like not enough people are conscious about it at this point. So is there, like I don't want to call it like a cheat sheet, but like, like a sheet for dummies kind of a situation that people can like tap into to understand like policy better from like an ethical design point of view. Like if you had to like say like two things from the top of your mind, what could that be?
Um, well, in our designs, there are two things again that are superbly important. One is the taking of consent and
Right.
how we can weave that into our design.
Mm-hmm.
Two is transparency around data.
Right.
How are we using the data?
Yeah.
What's happened with my data? Will
Right.
my data leak? Has my data leaked? You know, that's been a huge point of concern for all of us. We do get third parties which tell us that your passwords have been found, let's say, in a data leak, right?
Right.
Who was responsible for the data leak? We don't know. We
Yeah.
don't know where that data came from, right?
Right.
We use passwords in so many places, right? So it's not like it can come from one place, it can come from many places,
Right.
right? So the question over here is, where does this originate, right? And that's something that's more clearer today. That's
Yeah.
something that's more responsible. The whole piece that is more responsible today. There are more considerations around ethical design, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just compliance,
Yeah.
definitely not just compliance, because policy can never be ahead of us,
Right.
right? The world of policy will see what is possible. What have we made possible in the past, and
Yeah.
how can that go wrong? And therefore, put in the stop gaps, the thresholds, the various caps over it,
Yeah.
right? At that same time, uh, ethical design is about more than compliance and policy. Ethical design is about thinking about the impact of your design.
Right.
I remember I'd done this podcast a long time ago where somebody had asked me, how can a designer be ethical? And I'm
Right.
going to repeat what I said there. What I said there was that, ever since I started my career, every time I come up with something really great, really great, it sends a frisson down my spine. A little bit of a thing on your neck happens, your hair stands up, and it sends a bit of a frisson down your spine, right? And that's the point where you got to catch yourself and
Yeah.
take a step back and say, sure, this is great, but what impact is it going to have? And
Right.
think about it from various other ends, because that's where dark patterns originate from. Dark
Right.
patterns are hugely popular today because they are also hugely successful.
Yeah.
Right? So a dark pattern like the infinite scroll keeps us on many apps. I know I keep doom scrolling a lot, just before I go to sleep, right? So even though I talk about dark patterns, but even then I'm caught in them,
Yeah.
right? So dark patterns can't be caught by policy uh, in advance, right?
Yeah.
Policy, only say you cannot make dark patterns, right?
Yeah.
So it's up to us to understand those dark patterns and say, no, this pattern does not sound like it's going to be good for everybody up ahead, and I need to work at it.
Yeah.
So that's the point. Ethical design is all about understanding the overall impact of your design and then taking a step back and saying, I need to reconsider this, that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm a big big supporter of like being ethical, and also I'm gonna, if it's ever up to me, like I would end up like having this conversation entirely about ethical design, but that's not what we're here for. So let's dig into our conversation about like the Data Protection Act. And before we dig into the discussion, what are some keywords we should know, like as best practice to like, start with? We should know our words and meanings before we get into something. So, what are
Yeah.
like words and what do they mean to us?
Yes. So the biggest words that are there in the data protection bill had been there since the beginning. So for example, data fiduciary. What is a data fiduciary? Fiduciary is a person or a company that takes care of your data, that owns the data that you give them, and they use it, and they could also abuse it.
Yeah.
And they're called a fiduciary or a guardian because they're responsible for taking care of that data. That's why the word fiduciary has been used. And fiduciary is such a guardian-like word, right? When you look at law, it's a word that requires you to understand your responsibility and to be able to go through with it. Then the other word is data principal, and that's us, the data owner. So throughout the bill, the word data principal has been used for data owners, which is us. Our data gets taken into applications. Then we've got a very interesting piece, and I think it has a huge impact on us
Okay.
as designers, because the next word is data processor.
Right.
So data processor is someone who on the part of the data fiduciary processes personal data, and that's us, right? We ask for personal data, we
Yeah.
store personal data, we use personal data in various places in our design. So for example, we can ask for the mobile number, but it's our responsibility as a data processor to ensure that that mobile number is never shown on screen fully, right? That's
Mhm.
why that whole thing about XXX and the last four numbers is there,
Yeah.
right? So that's our role as a data processor. And of course, personal data. Personal data is basically any data which has the capability of harming the user by being out. And by harming, I don't just mean harming in the long-term physical harm sense. Any kind of a data which I hold precious and I hold close to my heart. It
Yeah.
could be my health data, it could be my financial data, it could be data which identifies me.
Right.
So for example, my phone number, my address, my name, etc., is all personal data,
Even your
right?
biometrics, right?
Yes, even your biometrics is all personal data. So this whole bill is about that kind of data. This whole bill is about data that should not be shared, data that we should be careful about sharing, storing, managing, etc. So that's the other definition around personal data. And of course, the definition of processing is really important. So it means a wholly or partly automated operation or a set of operations performed on digital personal data. What an interesting piece, right? Wholly or partly,
Wholly
right?
op- yeah.
Wholly or partly, right? So you can't say then that, oh, AI is using that data, we have no control over it, right?
Yeah.
Or the fact that this data is being used by the system, I have no responsibility on it. That
Yeah.
is not true, right? Everyone who's processing data does have a certain responsibility around that data.
Right.
And the last term is the data protection officer. And every company has compliance people, and these compliance people are then termed as data protection officers. And eventually, is the name of this data protection officer that needs to be out there in any communication around data privacy that you have. Let's say your terms and conditions, your consent dialogue, it's the name of the data protection officer, the contact details of the data protection officer that need to be published in that state. So those are some of the terms which are really important around data privacy in India. And in terms of our role, of course, that define our role, our company's role, our compliance people's role, and the data owner's role as well.
Okay. And just like a quick question about like data protection officer. This person is someone who is at the place of authority over data fiduciary, right?
That's right. In the data fiduciaries organization, this person has a place of authority. That's one. But that's not the only thing. It's not the only thing. It's not just about being responsible for data.
Right.
It's also being responsible for any interactions around that data. So if a user needs to, let's say, I need to modify a certain piece of data which is out there, which is wrongly stored.
Mm-hmm.
It's the data protection officer who's eventually responsible for modifying that data. Of course, it can be done through an automated interface
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. And there could be a whole team that's involved in it. But eventually, the responsibility falls with the data protection officer.
Protection officer.
And the biggest thing, and this has been true in a lot of places in Europe, in America, in Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. GDPR is also around that a user should be able to delete any data
Yeah.
that lies in there. And that's the biggest responsibility of the data protection officer,
Yeah.
to be able to delete any data which the user wants to delete.
Yeah. And there are so many platforms out there that do not allow you to delete yourself from their system.
Yeah,
So many
exactly.
of them.
So many of them. And now with the DPDP bill coming out, all of them will be liable.
Yeah. But would you say like it's more of the countries where these kind of laws have not been enforced that they suffer at the hands of these kind of like patterns, because it is still a dark pattern that you're not allowing somebody to exit the state that they're in, right? Like even if it's the state of being there on that platform. So do you think like is it because the countries are, like somewhat like adapting to these kind of policies now, that's why they're suffering at the hands of this? And then in Europe you have the GDPR where these kind of things would actually give you like big lawsuits.
Yeah. So logistically, India is a huge place.
Yeah.
We're humongous. We are one-sixth, right, of the total world's population.
Yeah.
And that's humongous. 8 billion people, and I say 1.2, 1.3.
1.3, somewhere around that.
1.4 is where we are right now. That's one-sixth of the world's population. And we don't have that much land mass.
Yeah.
Right? And neither do we have that much money.
True.
Right? You've got to consider that, right? And of course, abroad, the GDPR has been around for a long time. A lot of the data protection policies, which are in force across the world globally, have been around for a long time, and we are quite late.
Yeah.
And thank God that it's in the market now.
Yeah.
That it's become law now, right? There may be a lot of things that can still be improved and made better, but at the same time, we've got law. Now we've got that one thing that we can stand up and say, our data, that you have not secured our data. We can go to a fiduciary and say, you have not secured our data, right? So now the bed for lawsuits, the foundation for any data breaches, any problems that people have because of the sharing of their data will become superbly important in the court of law as well. And judiciary, although the judiciary today has been passing, judgments around data privacy, around any complaints around data privacy for a long time. It's
Yeah.
not that the judiciary has been absent.
Yeah.
Judiciary has been there. But we need a consistent way to benchmark everything, right? We need a consistent way to say this works in our country and this doesn't work in our country. And that's why the bill is there. That's why the bill is so important.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to absorb at the same time. Okay. So since we're like talking about data protection, we have to talk about like privacy and what does it mean like in today's context for like designers, for like people whose data it is. So what is the general meaning of privacy in the contemporary world?
Yeah. So 2017, I think, when Justice Puttaswamy put his entire judgment around privacy and how privacy has become a fundamental right of Indians today. And it wasn't earlier. It was not the fundamental right of Indians. It was never in the constitution. There was never a law around privacy, because we are such a populous country, right? And how can you ensure privacy for everyone? You probably can't, right? But at the same time, does that mean if you can't ensure privacy in the physical world, that privacy should not be ensured in the digital world, right? So that's where the bill comes in to ensure that our privacy is guaranteed according to how the world changed after the Puttaswamy judgment, right? The world changed into and actually was in response to the world changing. The world had changed into a more data sensitive, into a more and the amount of data being collected is, as you know, going up exponentially year by year, right? And if there were no law, if there were no rules around privacy, then we would have a problem, right? And the way the Puttaswamy judgment defines privacy is that a person's privacy and their data should be secured, should be hidden, should be, and if the user wants, they should be able to prevent anyone else from seeing that data, right? But and to reasonable, up to reasonable ends, right? So I think that defines privacy very well. That defines privacy very well. So our privacy is guaranteed unless there's a national security issue, unless there is a pandemic, unless we are in a health problem, unless we go to the hospital and we can't speak at that point in time. At that point in time, privacy may not be the best thing to keep in front of us, right? And life becomes more important. So those are the containments, the thresholds for privacy that have been put in by the Data Protection Bill. The fact that our privacy is sacrosanct. Our privacy should not be, and by privacy, they mean the leakage of the data, the usage of the data, other people knowing our personal data, other people using our personal data, right? All of that can be actually saved by the DPDP bill. But of course, it does put containments out there that those are the exceptional circumstances in which privacy does not apply. And I think that's huge. It's hugely important for a country like India. Otherwise, the way we used to see in movies, right? Somebody's been taken to the hospital and nobody admits them because there is an FIR to be done. Or there is there could be privacy issues, right? This guy can't speak. He can't say, yes, use my data. So I will not use this data and I'll not treat this person, right? And that's huge. It's humongous. So I think that we could use that as a scale to define our own privacy. Our own privacy is our own privacy, and it should be sacrosanct. We should be sovereign over our own data, unless and until it affects other people in harmful ways, or us in harmful ways. So that's how we can define our privacy.
That's a fair. So it gives you the autonomy to define it, and yet it can be maybe governed in a certain way. That's one way to say it. Interesting. Okay, so coming back to like designers and like how all of this is impacting us. So what has changed for designers today with the president assent of this Data Personal Protection Act, which is now in place? Because you were talking about like what you already saw in the previous version of it and what you came up with. But like now, what does it have? Like, what has changed for designers?
I don't think our life is affected so much, right?
Mhm.
The impact is not so great. The impact for our company, if there is a data breach and the company fails to report it, is humongous. Like I said, the fees and penalties go very high. The impact on us is that we already have the patterns that we need, right? Let me talk about one pattern, the terms and conditions pattern. I just call it terms and conditions pattern because that's where it was born, right?
Right.
Today it's the consent pattern, right?
Okay.
So the terms and conditions pattern when it was born, and I think it was born around the turn of the century, where we had to put a little terms and conditions below our form, and the guy had to click it and say yes. And then we turn to the fact that the terms and conditions are automatically accepted by you if you click on this button, right?
Yeah.
And now today, there are more than one terms and conditions. There are more than one buttons for us to click. When we
Right.
click those buttons and we submit the form, those buttons are all around how can we use your data in various ways, right? So can we use marketing? Can we use your data for marketing? Can we use your data for processing? Can we use your data for so on and so forth, right? So we already have the patterns. Now we've got to understand how to creatively use the patterns, right? Because there are two fundamental things that the Privacy Bill says.
Right.
One is that consent is mandatory. The other piece that it says is that in the consent dialogue itself, it needs to be an itemized, and itemized appears more than 7 times in the data bill, in the data protection bill, right? So it needs to be an itemized list of how you're going to use my data,
Right.
which means now we can no longer say we use your data for marketing purposes and that's the be all and end of it, all of it all. We've got to be able to tell them that we use your data for this and this,
Right.
right? If I'm taking your name, I'll use it to personalize the emails that I sent you. If I'm taking your name will appear on top of my screen and it's going to say good morning Ekta because you put in your name here, right? And so on and so forth. So the terms and conditions are now affected, but we have the pattern already, right? We just got to change the content in it, right? And also understand the fact that it can't be one single terms and conditions. It can't be one single itemized, humongous itemized list which nobody reads,
Yeah.
right? It needs to be within context of when you ask for this data. So when you ask for my name, you
Yeah.
gotta tell me how many ways are you going to use the name.
Yeah.
When you ask my age or my date of birth, you got to tell me how many ways are you going to use that date of birth. And that's just not it. If you're going to tell me how you're going to use it, then you can't use it for anything else.
Right.
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 So now it's become more binding. So it's not that I can tell you I'll use your data for marketing purposes and tomorrow sell it to
Okay.
marketers, right? So that kind of information needs to be shared. The other thing that needs to be shared is how many other parties are you sharing this data with?
Right.
That's very, very important. That's up to the data fiduciary to understand how many parties they're sharing the data with. And of course, in very complex organizations, in large supply chain based organizations, it is where your data travels, the designer, it's very difficult for the designer to know. So I'm
Yeah.
not saying it's easy.
Right.
It's not easy. It's just that we already have the foundation that we need to be able to do it. Our terms and conditions dialogue, our consent tick mark, we used to call it, the consent checkbox that's there. It's got a bigger role to play now.
Right.
It can actually be used in multiple places, not just one. And it can actually be used to the data owner's advantage. The
Right.
data principal can actually understand. If I look at the use of the consent dialogue in multifarious, very useful ways, and it's done very creatively over the application, it would not impede the journey of the user. and it would still ensure that the user knows exactly what kind of data is being used and how is it being used, right? So it's those patterns that have become superbly important today. And of course, there are various ways of weaving in how you're using that data into your application, right? For example, explainable AI and transparent AI tells you when it recommends something, why it's recommending something. When you go on LinkedIn, when you go on Netflix, it tells you are being recommended these movies because you watched X,
Yeah.
right? So that kind of explainability can be woven into various ways in which you're using the data, not just AI.
Yeah. So like to sum up, like, so two key things for a designer to remember is take consent, give transparency.
Yes.
Right.
And very well put. Yeah.
Because I was thinking of like my own experience as a design researcher, as a designer, and to start with, like the first thing when I'm recruiting and I'm sampling people, just like from like the basic level of like when you're designing something new or you're fixing something that's present. So that's where you start with, like you tell them why you're collecting your data. It's for research purposes, it's for Alana Falana, like whatever it is, but you do explain.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like I was in my head, I was bridging it with like those things, and I was like, okay, those two things we've already been practicing, but it's, let's say, like it kind of starts becoming like a dark pattern when you like start withholding information. You're just like trying to make it like faster for yourself. You're like, oh, I don't need to like tell them why I'm using it. Let me just like ask them, give me your information. But that's not
It
the right
affects
way,
our
right?
experience so much, and it
Yeah.
affects the data that we collect, especially in research, right? I
Right.
remember not having a well-made concept dialogue in place during research affects the way people answer questions.
Definitely.
Really affects it.
Yeah.
And I've had huge success in very, very data sensitive places in doing research where I've structured the consent dialogue very well. We've spent a lot of time on understanding what we need to say to the user, what we need to get permission for, what we need to assure him. Remember, in the consent dialogue, also, we assure him that we will not use this data to go
Yeah.
public, that we'll not use this data to go to do anything against you. It won't be used to harm you, and so on and so forth. So, very, very important to do that,
Yeah.
right? The whole piece is, and we've learned, and actually we can connect it back. And thank you, Manvi. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because we can connect it back to that experience, right? When
Yeah.
we do the consent properly, our data owner is so much more comfortable in answering our
Yeah.
questions. We have a much better interaction, much more qualitative interaction with the user when we do our consent properly. And that's the way the Data Protection Act is slated to affect our design. It's not meant to turn people away. It's not
Yeah.
meant to turn users away. It's meant to engage them more because they're more comfortable and they trust you a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's that foundation of like that trust that you're saying. And
Yeah.
like think like for like young designers, it's like a very big thing to understand, like if you start right, it's gonna end up being right, especially with these kind of bills coming in place.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And what a great thing to say, right? Well begun is half done, right?
Half done, yeah.
Yes.
So like like all these conversations flow, and then you have like these profound realizations about like your own journey. Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, I think like we're gonna close up our conversation with this last question that I have, and then I'm gonna invite people that are attending to send in their questions. So, last question that I have for you is, okay, we've spoken about a little bit about like touching upon AI right now. So, and like we've spoken about privacy bills. So, what are the likely changes coming ahead with which, like, it's gonna shape the way we design for the future? So with like these bills coming into place, and like designers becoming more conscious, stakeholders, companies thinking of like more consciously about how they're going to be using this data, instead of like sending our phone list to spam callers, those kind of things. So what do you think like is coming in the future?
In terms of policy, there's a lot coming our way. I mean, this is just the beginning. Right? We have the DNA bill in the Digital India Act. We've got the DNA bill. We've got the AI bill. We've got the Competition Act, which has already become law. The latest version, the latest amendment in the Competition Act has already become law, and we see um, our the fact that bias is so involved in our designs, right? Coming our way in the future. And it's like I said, it's coming through the AI Act, it's coming through the competition bill, it's coming through many places where we need to understand our biases and we need to ensure that they don't make their way into our designs. And how does that happen? We know that technology amplifies everything. Right. And no matter how much we try, and we do try as designers to ensure that biases don't make their way into our designs, right? We do try, after we do our research, we do try and ensure that biases are removed. We also try and ensure that in our way of questioning biases don't creep in, and so on and so forth. The way we synthesize data, we try and keep our biases out, but we're human beings, right? And we have biases, right? And not all biases are bad.
True.
Right? So, for example, a completely unbiased search results is a misnomer. Right? If you don't have biases, how will you even structure the search results?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right?
How do you judge?
How will you judge what is the best search result to show on top? Right? So you need those biases. But what you don't need are biases which don't follow the laws of the country. So I think it's very important. And people all across the world are also acknowledging the fact that it's extremely important that any biases that do creep in, we address those biases. And today we even have the technology to address them. So we can test our systems to understand what kind of biases are there. I know IBM has a offering like that. And I know many other people, many startups out there also have offerings like that to test biases and correct them. Right? So now we've got the tools to do it. Now we understand that those biases can be amplified and they can affect people. And the third thing is that we also understand that biases are we can't prevent biases from coming in. So we definitely need to understand, address those biases. And what are those biases that we need to address? Biases which don't follow the laws of the country. Biases which a racial bias or a gender bias or a community bias or other kinds of biases, which are against the laws of the country. So a bias towards people who are not special. Right. So, and so on and so forth. Richer people, bias for richer people. Also.
Economic disparity, those kind of things.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So what our way next is to understand and address those biases. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was touching upon like another thing that I was briefly a part of. So with Niyam and like yours and like a couple of other design leaders across the country, you had this initiative for women's security by design, right? It started like about like a year ago. So the question is around that, like, how does the new bill for them strengthen the aspects of women's privacy and security? What would be new and like, in how you've gauged the scenario at the moment? Like, how do you think like that's gonna affect women's security? Because there is design at play now with the policy. So
absolutely, hugely. And I think that's one of the biggest considerations in the bill as well, because gender is definitely personal data.
Yeah.
Right. And the fact that gender cannot be used, for harming us.
Right.
Is humongous. It's there in the data protection bill. Right. And I think thinking about the gender bias, I'm also very proud of the fact that now the Supreme Court has come up with the rules around how we think about gender and gender bias, right? So this bill, it addresses the data, the data principle, the data owner as she, not she. And I love that fact about the bill. In fact, that's the first thing that's on a blurb on my article, that reasons to love the bill. It calls everybody as she. How wonderful is that, right? And that in itself also removes a lot of gender disparity that we have, right? But there are other ways. So if our gender is protected, if the information around our gender is protected, then we don't give the world the tools to use to discriminate us, to discriminate against us on the basis of our gender. Right. So we're taking away that whole autonomy of the world to even understand that we're female.
Yeah. So a person is a person.
Judge us. Yeah, and to judge us in a separate way, right? So that's huge.
Yeah.
That of course is huge. But beyond that, you know, the fact that women's data should be kept a little bit more secure, the fact that, you know, there are wrongdoers out there who can
Right.
use that data
Right.
for various purposes. That I think that's one of the reasons why the bill is that much more airtight. It's that much more tighter,
Oh,
and that's why the penalties and the fees are there, so that if the data is leaked and it's used in a maleficent way,
yeah.
then the company is liable. So therefore, it puts that much more onus, that much more responsibility on the company to say yes. We should now protect the gender as a piece of personal data in better ways than we did earlier.
Right. And like I think like based on my experience of like designing products, I feel like in a lot of places that's not even a relevant information that you need while designing something. So why
Yes.
is it something that's being collected in the first place?
Yeah, and that's another thing in the bill, that it says that you may not collect more data than you need.
Yeah.
So now we'll have to be very careful about the data that we collect in our forms. If
Mm-hmm.
we don't need a set of data, we should not collect it, right?
Yeah.
If we can't have, enough of a justification for
Yeah.
collecting a piece of data, we should not collect it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. What an amazing discussion.
Yeah, even I really enjoyed it. Yes.
Okay, so I opened the room for questions if they have to flow in, and I already have a couple of questions that have come in the chat. So I'm gonna start with that. Okay. So just circling back on like ethical design a little bit. So if you can give like some specific examples of ethical design principles we need to design today in India.
Sure, absolutely. So I think the first principle of ethical design is something that we're discussing right now, is respect for the collection of data,
Mm-hmm.
respect for the usage of data, transparency around the usage of data,
Right.
and the autonomy of the user on that piece of data which is collected, right?
Okay.
That whole thing comes into the purview of the DPDP bill, right?
Okay.
But beyond that, we've got bigger responsibilities in ethical design, right? And I think one of the biggest primary responsibilities in ethical design is understanding whether we do our research in an unbiased way, and we've touched upon that. The fact
Right.
that we should do our research in an unbiased way. We should ensure that biases are not there in our research. When we use a certain data to synthesize a product, then the foundation of that data needs to be secure, needs to be free of any biases or any damaging actions on our part.
Mhm.
That's really
Right.
big, and I think that's been around for quite some time.
Okay.
All of us as designers do understand that to quite an extent, especially if you work with consulting organizations, if you work
Right.
with large organizations that have a bigger footprint. GDPR has been around for a really long time.
Yeah. True.
So therefore, we are, already aware of things like that. But we should absolutely ensure that they're not there. That's one,
Yeah.
right? The second thing is that dark patterns have a huge role to play in changing behavior across board,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the fact that I used to read and go to sleep earlier, and now I doom scroll and go to sleep,
Yeah.
it's a change in behavior for me.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's a change in behavior for everyone. I know it's a change in behavior for my
Yeah.
son, right?
Yeah.
So that's where dark patterns come in. And how do you recognize? There's no standard recipe to say, or a framework to say this is a dark pattern,
Dark pattern. Yeah. You have to
right?
like
And
look at the societal way of like what is happening in the world where the behavior is going down the drain.
yeah,
That sort of
exactly,
a situation.
exactly. So you need to be aware of your own dark patterns.
Right.
And we as designers need to be, I think it's us working against our own success,
Yeah. Okay.
right?
So just
Because
yeah. So go on. Sorry.
no, I'm saying that we work against our own success when we include dark patterns in our design. That's a huge ethical piece
Right.
Um, yeah.
Okay, so like touching upon the same thing with an example. So if I were a designer working on a fintech app that promises micro loans, so
Mm.
how could be how would I have to be more responsible today in that aspect? Because I think like talking about this kind of like organizational example would give us like a better idea, even
Yeah,
from a designer's perspective.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's quite big. Um, so dark patterns are not just around protecting us.
Mm-hmm.
Dark patterns are also around protecting the law, right?
Right.
Especially in finance and underwriting, it's a huge thing. In finance and underwriting, protecting the law, compliance, banking, it's a huge thing, right? So one of the dark patterns that we have is the back button, right? So when we give in our data and we look at what kind of financial services do we have access to by
Mm.
giving in our data. And of course, in banking, you have to give a lot of data, right?
Yeah.
So what kind of services do we have access to if we give in a huge amount of data? Um, the back button there, which allows us to, when we look at the services and we say, no, that's not what I want.
Yeah.
And the first time we've told the truth,
Yeah.
right? And then we press the back button and we change that data. And of course, facts can't be changed, right? Facts
Right.
cannot be molded, right? So I can't say that if I'm above 60, I can't say that I'm less than 60 to get
Right.
a better, right? So that to me definitely is a dark pattern
Yeah.
because loan will not be approved.
Yeah.
Right? You will eventually not have access to that financial service, but
Yeah.
you're actually spending a lot of time, a lot of energy, and you're wasting a lot of resources on the financiers end as well
Right.
by going back and changing that data and then trying to fudge it somehow through the documentation. Right.
Yeah.
So that's a very, very typical example. Right.
Right.
The other piece is that banks are allowed to keep our data for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Banks are allowed to keep our data for up to 10 years. Although other people, by the DPDP bill, other people who take our data are liable for that data unless they remove it after their period of use
Mm-hmm.
ends, right?
Yeah.
So when personal data is taken during a banking transaction, we need to ensure that the user knows that this data will be there with the bank for X number of years, right? It's different for different countries, different for different jurisdictions, but at the same time, it's information that needs to be given, right?
Yeah.
That's one. The other piece is that all the information that's shared during a banking or a financial services transaction is very, very, very sensitive information. And there's a lot of data sensitivity around that. So we need to ensure that we tell the user that this information will not be used for anything else. It will just be used for underwriting that loan.
Right.
So extremely important for the data comfort
Right.
of the principal.
Down
Yeah.
to transparency bit that I was saying.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And of course, it's banking, right? It's underwriting. You can't be fully
Yeah.
transparent.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
That's the nature of underwriting. It's an opaque process
Right.
and it cannot be made fully transparent. I cannot tell you that you did not get the loan because of X thing,
Yeah.
right? You
Yeah.
can only guess.
You can only guess. Yeah.
So those kind of rules should be made absolutely apparent to you, right?
Mm.
But at the same time, there needs to be a certain amount of opaqueness in the transaction because it is a financial transaction.
True.
So you have to play that game very, very carefully. You
Yeah.
have to play the transparency game very, very carefully in that case.
Right. And it's like it's highly important. Like
It is very important.
very
Very,
important.
very
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay, then we have like last three questions that have come in the chat. So first is how can one decide which is personal information and which is not if somebody is working on a persona project such as women's health? Is there any guideline to keep in mind? So yeah.
See, personas are, although they're made in real data, but personas cannot identify an individual,
Right.
right? So you can rest assured that anything that you're doing on the basis of personas does not identify an individual. Of course, you can also make sure of that you don't make a persona on the basis of a individual,
Yeah.
right? So personas are fictitious characters. They cannot be real people, right? So therefore, any data that you use in a persona can be used fully and without any problem, because it is fictitious data at the end of the day. It cannot be tied back to an individual. And that is the definition of personal data.
Right.
Personal data is sensitive when it can be tied back to me,
Mm-hmm.
right? So let's say my health data around how I behave when I take discipline. What's the effect of discipline on me, right?
Mm-hmm.
If that data is taken without any identifying characteristics, then it's not personal data,
Right.
right? But the moment it says, Ekta behaves in this way when she takes discipline, that's personal data.
Because you're personifying that data when you're putting it in the research bit.
If the data can be used to find for a person to find their way back to me, then it's personal data. If
Right.
the data can be used in any harmful ways to harm me in any manner, then that's personal data, right? So for example, the fact that I have AIDS is definitely extremely personal data,
Yeah.
right? The world should not know,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or unless I want to tell the world, or the
Yeah.
fact that I'm gay,
Right.
right?
Right.
So those kinds of things which the world can use to harm you can be classified as personal data, and that's how it's been classified in the bill as well. That's how it's been classified by many judgments that have come before that as well.
Right. Got it. Yeah, because I think like when people are working on their personal projects, a lot of personal information, not as a bias, but as like an insight starts to come in, right? And that's when like a lot of projects are also launched. Like maybe some companies are born out of the personal needs as well, and that's when a whole research goes into play. So I think the question was surrounding that bit, like when you're starting, when you're working on those kind of things. So when is personal information, like can be like kept non-personal, but those attributes can be taken in, and I think that you just like very quick, like in very like crisp words answer that for us.
Yeah, a good practice is to once you've done the research, once you've synthesized it, go back and remove personal data. Go back and remove names. Go back and remove addresses. Go back and remove phone numbers and
Mhm.
other kinds of identifiable pieces of data which can be used to trace that data back to me.
Right.
Those should be removed, and then that data should be stored.
Right. Okay. Okay, so our next question is, what's your take on this humongous invasion of privacy and data collection, including shadow profiling by WhatsApp, Truecaller? How they can they continue unhindered with like what's happening in the Indian act space?
See, at the end of the day, a shadow profile, when it's made of yours, is a viable, lawful thing to do
Hmm.
unless the shadow profile is used to harm you,
Okay.
right? So
Right.
that's the interpretation of
Hmm.
the bill, and that's the interpretation of all the other bills out there as well, right?
Okay.
And the fact that digital twin technology is there today,
Right.
and it can actually be used to optimize so much in this world.
Right.
So much.
Right.
Ships can run better, machinery can run better, systems can be maintained better. And there's so many advantages that it brings in
Yeah.
as we go towards the future where sustainability is a huge deal. Digital twins will have a huge impact on the way we bring in sustainability,
Hmm.
right? um, because that the digital twins allow us to optimize our resources.
Yeah.
Now, advertising that we do is not blitzkrieg. The moment something is launched, everywhere we go, we won't see, banners, this, that, advertisements on TV, advertisements, being handed to us on the street, and in a blitzkrieg. We may not even have anything to do with it. So I may receive an advertisement for a preschool. I don't have a preschool going child, but I still may receive an advertisement for it,
Yeah.
right? So how can somebody ensure that I'm not being inundated with data?
Right.
Now, data inundation is a huge thing. People then go crazy when they're inundated with data.
Okay.
It
So
can
I
actually, yeah.
yeah. No, no. So I was so I'm getting this like side note that shadow profiling is being made without the consent, right? So it's still continuously enriched with these sort of entities. So in their opinion, like it's definitely a violation.
Yeah, but it really cannot be. The companies who are doing shadow profiling, like Facebook, like are humongous platforms who have had this responsibility globally to have consent in place. And so that they definitely do have consent in place, right? Where shadow profiling is being done today, most of, I wouldn't say everybody, and I'm not qualified to say everybody. I haven't checked that out. But what I do know is that, since globally these rules have been in place for quite some time, any shadow profiling which is being done by global companies, really large companies, which have already taken your consent. But do you remember that your consent was taken?
But like in a lot of spaces, like this constant this consent form that we see, it's so text heavy that most users don't read through it. So a lot of us, like at the end of like being the final users, were not like aware of the consents that we're giving out. So at the end, when we hear about these kind of things, it still becomes like a violation, right?
Yes. Now with the DPDP bill out, it is a violation because you have not been told in so many words in an itemized manner. Itemized is a big word. Huh? That's why it's being repeated so many times in the data protection bill. And there are companies which are fighting the whole itemized piece.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because it doesn't occur anywhere across the world in policies that it should be an itemized list.
Yeah.
It does occur in the Indian context that it should be an itemized list.
I think it could be because of our literacy levels and understanding of digital literacy. To when you break things down, it's easier to like understand and absorb it.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
that the reason?
And that's the reason why the bill also has the option of having your terms and conditions and your consent dialogue in various languages. The
Right.
bill says that the responsibility for making the consent dialogue understandable for the user is the data fiduciary's responsibility, and the data protection and the data processor's responsibility, the data protection officer and the data processor's responsibility. So eventually, if it's coming down to the data processor, it's coming down to us, right? So we need to ensure that anybody who goes through a consent dialogue remembers what they gave consent for.
Right.
But for example, like we don't remember today what all we've given consent to Facebook for, what all have we given
Yeah.
consent to Google for, what all have we given consent to Instagram for. But that's one thing that is come out in the data protection bill, that the data principal should understand it, and actually there can be liability and lawsuits on the basis of that I didn't understand your.
Yeah. So like just like touching upon that and like the shadow profile thing that we were talking about. So how is like consent of like a shadow profile even taken? Because you're taking the consent of the direct end user for like everything that you're, like up at least that's how it's been done until now, right? Like it's for the end product. But then the people who get shadow profile, those people are not notified again.
Yeah, that's another responsibility that's coming through in the DPDP bill, that
Right.
if you already have data of your data principles and you're storing that data, then when you use that data, you need to take consent. You need to retake consent
We take consent.
from the users. Yeah.
Right.
So, and that's something that a lot of people are opposing, and it may come out in an amendment as well, because of course it's a huge responsibility. It's
Yeah.
an expensive responsibility to have as well. But right now it is law, right? So maybe in the time that it's being implemented, in the time that people are following that responsibility, we will perhaps remove all of the cases where consent was not taken properly, right?
Right.
So, definitely that's a big deal. The fact that your consent was not taken in so many words and not in a clear manner, and your
Right.
digital twin is made.
Yeah.
But to be fair, the GDPR ensures the GDPR requires a company to tell you what are they going to use the data for. So, for example, on Facebook, the digital twin is used to target advertising. It's used to target content, and it's used to target different other kinds of messages to you, right?
Okay.
So and Facebook does ensure that that outcome is declared when you give your consent for it. The privacy policy of Facebook is quite tight, so I don't think even that will get too affected. It will get affected, but it won't get too affected by the DPDP bill, because I don't think that's where our danger is coming from.
Right.
Our data to be leaked from Facebook, unless we make our data public, is kind of difficult, because Facebook, of course, is a humongous organization and we've never heard of a data breach in Facebook, right?
Yeah.
But the smaller organizations that are there, smaller e-commerce platforms, smaller other, we've got a whole spectrum of startups in the Indian landscape. Those startups are where this responsibility squarely falls on their shoulders. If they're creating a digital twin or a shadow profile, they need to ensure that the outcome of the shadow profile is absolutely clear to you.
Okay, so like in all of this scenario, to understand like who's violating who. So who is violating the privacy? Is it the platform or the end user who's ratted you out because your name was in the contact list and then they gave access and that's how your data was shared? So who is the one that would be considered as the one who's violating?
Fiduciary. The data fiduciary is the
Okay.
one who's
Would be the
violating
platform in that
the platform.
it
The
would be the
platform.
platform.
Right. And it is indeed your platform.
Yeah.
So when data gets leaked from platforms, those are the places where it's used in multifarious, dangerous ways, right? Of course, any data that you make public on a platform, that you ensure that anybody in the world can see that data, nobody can hold the platform responsible for that, right? And there is a platform bill that ensures that does not happen. If you have shared your data in a public manner, so the responsibility does fall on your shoulders as well.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not like the data principal is now devoid of all responsibility. They can do whatever they want. And the data platform needs to be then the babysitter, sitting the baby, right? No, not at all. The responsibility is on so many shoulders, right? The responsibility is on my shoulder as a data principal to ensure that I don't share my data with other people, that I don't make it public. That's one. The second responsibility is on the basis of designers who, when they collect that data, should make sure that the reason why they're collecting that data is one, contained. It's not being taken for one thing and then being used for another. And the third responsibility is the data fiduciaries. Right? The data fiduciary should ensure that they have enough of security on their platform so that data breaches don't happen.
Yeah.
The data fiduciary should ensure that nobody from their organization is selling that data, and that happens quite a bit, right? So now all that has become illegal. So that's very good, right?
We have Niyam here being spicy in the chats and he's citing. So anyone who has like Prime Minister Modi's number in their contacts and are in touch with him over voice, text, and WhatsApp are contributing to his shadow profile. And even if the PM himself may have declined sharing this contact profile in Truecaller, Instagram, WhatsApp, but may not have like an account on these platforms, but he's still being shadow profiled in some ways.
Oh, absolutely. I'm pretty sure the opposition has a shadow profile.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure. No.
How do you
I'm
ensure?
pretty sure he has shadow profiles on everybody important in the opposition as well.
Yeah, that is true. And I think that's when it becomes about like national security from that
Yeah.
point of view. So
Yeah.
we all have shadow profiles, even if we like try to stay away from it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Niyam's talking about the platform per se.
Yeah. So platforms will, I don't know if they have a shadow profile for our prime minister or any of our ministers or not. But if they do for all of us, then their shadow profile should be there for them as well. But we are the ones who reveal our personal data on those platforms. So
Yeah.
our shadow profile is going to be very rich and very interesting.
Yeah.
And the prime minister's shadow profile is going to be that information which they have deigned to release in public.
Right.
Right? So
So
understand that your shadow profile can only be made by data that's revealed by you.
that's revealed by you. So it all comes down to like personal responsibility with your own data.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So like
Definitely.
have like different people that are responsible, starting with yourself, then the fiduciary, then the platforms. But it starts with yourself.
Absolutely, absolutely. So all kinds of protection start with yourself, right? So if you're going to put, if there's a shootout and you go put yourself out there, then of course you're more liable to get shot, right? So yeah, it's definitely at the data principles end that they should not reveal data, but at the same time, the data fiduciary has a responsibility to ensure that if I'm revealing my data, it tells me that this data may be dangerous to reveal.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of discussions around whether TikTok can actually, give a warning when a child is uploading a video of theirs that, this video has potential for misuse. Or when a parent is uploading a video of the child, that it has potential for misuse.
Yeah.
Because from TikTok as a platform, you see so many people putting up videos of their children, which can be actually construed to be very dangerous if they're out there.
Yeah, there are a lot of speculations also with the AI reading images and videos. So it's a dangerous world out there in that sense.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. The potential for misuse is so high with AI, but I think that is the subject matter of another conversation. Yeah.
It's true. That is true. Okay,
Yeah.
so this is like the final call for any more questions here in the audience.
Great. I've really enjoyed this conversation, guys, and beautiful questions. Wonderful questions. Yeah.
So many insights. Like somebody even wrote like a message in the group because they had to leave early. So they were saying, cannot stress enough how enlightening this session has been. Couldn't stay back for the whole Q&A, but I'm leaving with a new perspective on how to handle privacy better. So
Wow.
I'm glad. I'm sure like all of us have like a lot of takeaways from this. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I don't think we have any more questions coming in. And at this note, I'm going to thank everyone for coming in and keep your eyes open for the next chat bubble. And thank you so much, Ekta, for being here and talking to us about like how can we be more conscious designers, better stakeholders, and great end users in terms of like how we put our information out there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Manvi, and thank you, Niyam. Thanks, guys, for attending the chat. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.